On April 20th, 1889, a boy was born in a small Austrian town named Linz. His name was Adolf Hitler, and no one could have predicted that this unremarkable child would one day plunge the world into its deadliest conflict. His father was a customs official, stern and demanding. Young Adolf dreamed of becoming an artist, but life had other plans. Rejected from art school twice, humiliated and bitter, he drifted through Vienna, watching the empire crumble around him. In these years of failure and rage, the seeds of a terrible ideology took root in his mind, seeds that would grow into a genocide that consumed millions. The Great War, which raged from 1914 to 1918, left Europe traumatized and transformed. Germany, blamed for starting the war and punished with crushing reparations by the Treaty of Versailles, felt deep humiliation. The German economy collapsed. Families starved. Unemployment soared to catastrophic levels. In the beer halls of Munich, a young war veteran named Adolf Hitler began speaking about national resurrection and racial superiority. His words, delivered with hypnotic intensity, resonated with a desperate people seeking someone to blame for their suffering. He blamed the Jews, the communists, the weak leaders, anyone but the German people themselves. He promised to restore German greatness and reclaim the territories lost in the war. Slowly, methodically, he built a movement. By 1933, Hitler had leveraged his political skills, economic desperation, and nationalist fervor into absolute power. He became Chancellor of Germany on January 30th. Within months, he dismantled democracy. The Reichstag, the German parliament building, mysteriously caught fire, and Hitler used the incident to suspend civil liberties and ban opposition parties. The machinery of totalitarianism was now in motion. Those who spoke against the regime disappeared into concentration camps. Newspapers were controlled. Schools indoctrinated children with Nazi ideology. The Gestapo, the secret police, created a climate of fear where neighbors informed on neighbors and trust evaporated from society like morning mist. Hitler believed in Lebensraum, living space, the idea that Germans needed to conquer vast territories to the east to prosper and survive. This was not merely political ambition, it was an ideology built on the belief that some races were superior to others, and that inferior peoples, particularly Slavs and Jews, were meant to be enslaved or exterminated. He began secretly rearming Germany, building an enormous military machine despite the Versailles Treaty, explicitly forbidding it. He tested the resolve of Britain and France, occupying the Rhineland in 1936. They protested but took no action. He annexed Austria in 1938. Again, no meaningful response. He demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate for peace, gave it to him. Chamberlain returned to London, claiming to have achieved peace for our time. He was catastrophically wrong. In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, finally revealing his true intentions to the world. The mask of legitimate territorial recovery was dropped. This was pure conquest. Britain and France, at last understanding the danger they faced, began preparing for war. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator who had murdered millions of his own people during forced collectivization, watched events unfold with calculating eyes. On August 23, 1939, Stalin and Hitler, ideological enemies, shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact. They also included a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. For Hitler, this pact was the final green light. He could now invade Poland without fear of Soviet interference. On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., the German Luftwaffe descended on Polish airfields with devastating precision. Waves of bombers destroyed Polish planes on the ground before they could even launch. German tanks, supported by mechanized infantry and coordinated air support, poured across the Polish border in overwhelming numbers. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a revolutionary tactic that combined speed, firepower, and coordination to achieve rapid victory. The Polish army, equipped with outdated weapons and cavalry, fought with extraordinary courage against impossible odds, but they could not stop the German onslaught. Within weeks, Poland was defeated and partitioned between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. On September 3rd, Britain and France, honoring their commitments to Poland, declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The winter of 1939 and spring of 1940 became known as the Phony War. After Poland's swift defeat, military operations in Western Europe seemed to pause. Britain and France, stunned by the German military's effectiveness, sat behind their defensive fortifications, particularly the Maginot Line along the French border. They prepared for a long, grinding conflict of attrition, as had characterized the First World War. Meanwhile, German soldiers occupied Poland, and a darkness unlike anything Europe had seen in centuries began to descend. The Nazi regime had always planned to use Eastern Europe as a dumping ground and a source of slave labor. Jews were rounded up from their homes and forced into ghettos, sealed off sections of cities where tens of thousands were crammed into unsanitary conditions with barely enough food to survive. The Gestapo and SS units followed the conquering armies, systematizing oppression and beginning the machinery of genocide. In April 1940, Hitler launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a single day, offering virtually no resistance. Norway, though it fought back, was quickly overwhelmed by German forces arriving by sea and air. The British attempted to intervene, but were outmaneuvered and forced to evacuate. Norway provided Germany with critical iron ore supplies and strategic positions overlooking the North Sea. More importantly, Hitler had demonstrated that his ambitions extended far beyond Eastern Europe. He was building a continental empire across the entirety of the European continent. The Western powers realized too late the magnitude of the threat they faced. On May 10th, 1940, Germany launched Operation Fall Gelb Plan Yellow, the invasion of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Rather than attacking the heavily fortified Maginot Line directly, German generals had devised an audacious strategy. They would punch through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French believed was impassable to large armies. The French command structure, built around static defense and the assumption of a long war of attrition, proved incapable of adapting to rapid mechanized warfare. German tanks raced through broken terrain, while French and British forces, confused and disconnected, tried desperately to respond. The Dutch army fell in 5 days. The Belgian army retreated in disorder. The British Expeditionary Force, comprised of over 300,000 troops, found itself trapped and facing encirclement and annihilation. From May 26th to June 4th, 1940, Operation Dynamo unfolded on the beaches of Dunkirk, France. The British Army, facing certain destruction, undertook a desperate evacuation across the English Channel. Every available vessel, naval destroyers, merchant ships, fishing boats, pleasure yachts piloted by civilian volunteers converged on the beaches. The Royal Air Force, fighting with extraordinary bravery despite being outnumbered, provided air cover against the German Luftwaffe. In one of history's most dramatic rescues, over 300,000 troops were evacuated to Britain. It was a military defeat, but it became a symbol of British defiance and national determination. The soldiers who escaped would live to fight again. The British people, watching their army return from the beaches, hardened their resolve. They would not surrender, no matter what came. France, the great military power that had seemed invincible just months earlier, collapsed in a matter of weeks. The German army drove toward Paris from multiple directions. The French government, overwhelmed and demoralized, abandoned the capital and fled southward. On June 14th, 1940, German troops entered Paris unopposed. Parisians watched in shock and despair as swastika flags were raised over their beloved city. On June 22nd, France signed an armistice with Germany. The nation was divided. The north occupied directly by German forces, the south allowed nominal independence under a collaborationist government based in the spa town of Vichy. For the French people, it was a catastrophe and a humiliation that would scar the national consciousness for generations. Those who could escape fled to Britain or North Africa. General Charles de Gaulle, refusing to accept defeat, announced from London that the fight would continue. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war, he declared. Britain now stood entirely alone against Nazi Germany. With France defeated, Italy having entered the war on Germany's side, and most of Europe under Axis control or occupation, the British Isles faced invasion. German forces massed across the English Channel. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister in May as the German offensive began, rallied his nation with speeches that would echo through history. "We shall defend our island home, whatever the cost may be," he told Parliament. "We shall never surrender." The British people, though terrified of invasion and bombing, believed him. They had no other choice. Across the nation, Home Guard units civilians armed with whatever weapons could be found, prepared to resist a German landing. Air raid shelters were dug, children were evacuated from cities. The nation braced itself for the expected German assault. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 and lasted until October. This was not a battle fought on land or sea, but entirely in the skies above the British Isles. The Luftwaffe, confident in its superiority, launched sustained attacks against British airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories, and population centers. German bombers arrived in waves, seeking to destroy the Royal Air Force and establish air superiority, which would allow German invasion forces to cross the Channel safely. For weeks, the battle raged. The Spitfire and Hurricane fighters of the Royal Air Force, though often outnumbered 3-1, fought with desperate skill and courage. Many pilots flew multiple sorties in a single day, landing to refuel and rearm only to take off again. Many did not return. The civilians of Britain endured constant aerial bombardment in what became known as the Blitz. London, the capital, bore the brunt of the assault. Night after night, German bombers dropped tons of ordnance on the city, destroying homes, factories, and historic landmarks. Families huddled in underground stations, the subway system converted into air raid shelters waiting for the all-clear sirens. Children slept on platforms as bombs fell above. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Yet the British people refused to break. They developed a kind of grim humor and determination that became known as the Blitz spirit. Rescue workers, firefighters, and ordinary citizens worked around the clock, pulling survivors from the rubble. The nation, under the leadership of Churchill and the steadfastness of its people, held firm. By October 1940, it had become clear that the Luftwaffe could not achieve air superiority. The German pilots, operating at the limit of their fighter range, were being defeated by British pilots defending their own skies. The German fighter escorts could not adequately protect the bombers. Germany's fighter production, though impressive, could not replace losses fast enough. Hitler, frustrated by the failure to break British resistance and eager to turn his attention to the Soviet Union, postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. Operation Sea Lion, as the German invasion plan was called, would never be launched. Britain had survived. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. A small island nation, fighting alone, had stood against Nazi Germany and prevailed. On June 22, 1941, Hitler made a decision that would transform the entire war. He turned on his supposed ally and invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion in history, involving over 3 million troops, supported by tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler's hatred for communism and the Soviet Union was visceral and ideological. He believed that Lebensraum lay in the vast territories of Eastern Europe and Russia. He also believed that Slavic peoples were racially inferior and destined to be enslaved or eliminated. The Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, a man as ruthless and paranoid as Hitler himself, had been caught by surprise. Though he had intelligence warnings of the invasion, Stalin had chosen not to believe them. The non-aggression pact he had signed with Hitler just 2 years earlier lay in ruins. The Red Army, though initially reeling from the surprise of the invasion, began to mobilize for what would become the most devastating war of attrition in human history. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in the opening months. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Yet the Soviet people fighting for their homeland's survival rallied under Stalin's leadership. Women and children were conscripted into labor brigades to produce weapons and ammunition. The Soviet Union's vast territory and enormous population reserves, though seemingly infinite, were being consumed in the furnace of war. By the end of 1941, over 1 million Soviet soldiers had been killed. The war on the Eastern Front would become the deadliest theater of the entire conflict, where more people would die than in all other theaters combined. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan pursued its own imperial ambitions. In December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Over 1,000 American sailors died in the assault. The United States, though it had been supporting Britain with supplies and material, had remained officially neutral. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in a speech to Congress, called it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan on December 8th. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States. The war that had begun with Poland's invasion was now truly global, engulfing the entire planet and drawing hundreds of millions of people into its maelstrom. By 1943, the tide of war had begun to shift, though the fighting ahead would prove even more brutal than what had come before. In North Africa, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery defeated the German Afrika Korps at the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, halting the Axis advance toward the Suez Canal. In the Pacific, American forces, accepting that this war would require enormous sacrifice, began their slow island-by-island advance toward Japan. Victories at the Coral Sea and Midway in May 1942 marked crucial turning points. Japan's naval superiority, so decisive in the war's opening months, was permanently broken. The Japanese began a long retreat that would only end with their surrender nearly 3 years later. On the Eastern Front, the turning point came at Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River named after the Soviet dictator. For months, from August 1942 to February 1943, the city was the site of some of the most brutal urban combat in human history. German and Soviet forces fought building by building, street by street, room by room. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died. The city was obliterated. Civilians starved or were killed in the crossfire. By February 1943, the German Sixth Army, encircled and cut off from supplies, surrendered. Over 200,000 German and Allied troops had been killed, and another 200,000 were captured. It was a catastrophic defeat, and it marked the beginning of the Soviet advance westward toward Germany that would only end with Soviet victory. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed racially or socially undesirable by the Nazi regime, unfolded with industrial precision throughout the war years. Concentration camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor became factories of death. Jews were rounded up from across occupied Europe, transported in cattle cars, and upon arrival at the camps, many were immediately sent to the gas chambers. The bodies were cremated in ovens or disposed of in mass graves. Gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, political opponents, homosexuals, and the disabled were also targeted for extermination. The Holocaust was not a side effect of the war or an aberration. It was central to Nazi ideology and a primary goal of the regime. It represented industrial-scale murder on a scale never before witnessed. On July 10, 1943, American and British forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. This was the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. After weeks of fighting, Sicily was secured. The invasion shocked Italy and destabilized the Italian government. Mussolini, the fascist dictator who had ruled Italy for over 20 years, was overthrown by his own cabinet. The new Italian government, recognizing that the war was lost, signed an armistice with the Allies. Yet Germany moved quickly to occupy most of Italy and defend against further Allied advances. The Italian campaign would prove long and costly, with the Allies advancing slowly up the peninsula against determined German resistance. Rome was finally liberated on June 4, 1944. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Allies had established complete air superiority over Europe. American and British bombers ranged freely across Nazi-occupied territory, striking military targets, industrial facilities, and civilian areas. The bombing campaign, particularly the firebombing of German cities, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and devastated industrial capacity. In Japan, American B-29 Superfortress bombers conducted similar campaigns, incinerating entire cities with napalm and conventional bombs. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Yet despite the devastation, neither Germany nor Japan showed any sign of surrendering. Both nations' leadership was committed to fighting to the last man. On June 6th, 1944, Operation Overlord commenced. Over 150,000 Allied troops, American, British, Canadian, and others, crossed the English Channel in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The night before, thousands of transport aircraft dropped airborne troops behind German lines to secure bridgeheads and disrupt German reinforcements. The beach landings were ferocious. At Omaha Beach, American forces suffered catastrophic casualties as they waded through machine gun fire and navigated obstacles on the shore. Yet they persisted. By the end of the day, the beaches were secured and a foothold in Normandy had been established. Within weeks, the Allies had built up their forces and begun the liberation of France. The campaign in Normandy was brutal, with hedgerow fighting in the Bocage grinding away at both sides. Yet the Allies had numerical and material superiority, and German forces, though fighting skillfully, could not stem the tide. On August 25th, 1944, Paris was liberated. French crowds poured into the streets, weeping with joy after 4 years of Nazi occupation. General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées, reclaiming the capital for free France. Yet the war was far from over. German forces, though in retreat, continued to fight with discipline and skill. In December 1944, Hitler launched a last desperate offensive in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces achieved initial surprise and drove a wedge into American lines. Yet American forces rallied, and within weeks the offensive was repulsed with enormous casualties on both sides. Germany had exhausted its reserves. There would be no more offensives, only a slow, inexorable retreat toward the fatherland. In the east, the Soviet army had liberated Poland and pressed relentlessly toward Germany. Soviet forces entered Warsaw, then pushed westward. By January 1945, Soviet forces stood on the borders of East Prussia and Poland, poised for the final assault on Germany itself. The Soviet Union, though nominally allied with the United States and Britain, had its own designs for post-war Europe. Stalin was determined that any territories conquered by Soviet forces would remain under Soviet influence and control. Tensions between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, held in check by the common enemy, began to surface. The Grand Alliance that had defeated the Axis powers was fraying even as the war neared its end. In the Pacific, American forces had island-hopped their way across thousands of miles of ocean. By early 1945, they were striking directly at the Japanese home islands. Japan's situation was hopeless, yet its military leadership refused to consider surrender. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man rather than surrender, treating capture as a fate worse than death. The firebombing of Japanese cities continued relentlessly. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other major urban centers were incinerated. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Yet still Japan fought on. American military planners calculated that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost 1 million American lives and many more Japanese casualties. An alternative was being developed in secret, the atomic bomb. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had led America through the Great Depression and guided the nation through most of the war, suddenly died in office. Vice President Harry Truman assumed the presidency at the war's most critical moment. Days later, on April 30th, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker, the Führer bunker. His body was carried outside and burned by his staff, denying the Soviets the satisfaction of capturing him alive. Germany, now led by Admiral Karl Donitz and other successors Hitler had designated, lacked any remaining will to resist. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed the Instrument of Surrender, unconditionally surrendering to the Allied powers. The war in Europe was over. Church bells rang across Britain and America. Crowds celebrated in the streets. After nearly 6 years of war, the nightmare of fascism in Europe had been vanquished. But Japan continued fighting. President Truman, having just learned about the Manhattan Project and the development of atomic weapons, faced an agonizing decision. He could order an invasion of Japan, accepting enormous casualties, or he could use the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew toward the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., it released a single atomic bomb. The explosion obliterated the city in a flash of light and heat. Approximately 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks and months from radiation sickness and injuries. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki with similar devastating results. On August 15th, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. The war was over. The world emerged from World War II, transformed and devastated. Between 56 and 80 million people had died, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire cities lay in ruins. Economies were shattered. The Holocaust and other atrocities had exposed the depths of human cruelty and the consequences of unchecked hatred and ideology. Yet from the ashes, humanity demonstrated remarkable resilience. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe and Japan. The United Nations was created to prevent another such catastrophe. Survivors rebuilt their nations and their lives. The war had tested humanity to its limits and revealed both our darkest impulses and our capacity for courage, sacrifice, and ultimately renewal. The lessons learned, though often imperfectly applied, would shape the second half of the 20th century and influence human civilization for generations to come.